Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Liz Lauder. I am the president of the White Bear Lake Area League of Women Voters. The League is a co-sponsor of tonight's event, along with Common Cause of Minnesota. The White Bear Lake Area League is one of 35 local leagues that make up the League of Women Voters Minnesota, which next year celebrates its 100th year of bringing the voters of this state up-to-date information on issues, access to lawmakers and candidates, and a platform to advocate for reform. We do not support or oppose political candidates or parties, and the views expressed by our panelists tonight do not necessarily reflect the views of the League of Women Voters. But we do have positions on issues, and we come to those positions after careful study and the consensus of our members. Our state website, LWVMN.org, you can find our positions on public policy issues, including redistricting, and resources that provide in-depth discussion of those issues. We have a national reputation for integrity, and I hope that you will consider becoming a member and being part of our work of registering and educating voters and helping them to participate in the process of reform. And reform is the reason we are here tonight. Soon after the 2020 census, each state will have to draw new election maps for congressional and legislative districts. Maps that could not only change the political landscape, but also impact representative democracy in each state and our country for the next 10 years. That makes the 2018 election in Minnesota so important. The new governor and legislators elected in 2018 will be in a position to determine how new electoral district boundaries are drawn in 2020. Our panel will discuss how drawing new district boundaries can affect our representative democracy. They will also look at Minnesota's past experiences with this process, our changing demographics, and describe alternative ways to draw new maps that eliminate the inherent conflict of interest when legislators choose their voters themselves. By the end of this event tonight, we want you to be better informed about how district maps are drawn, give you ideas for ways of improving our current process, and give you tools and methods for making your ideas known to candidates and lawmakers. We have a very knowledgeable and engaging group of panelists tonight who will be guiding us through the sometimes murky process of drawing legislative district maps that we call redistricting. Our moderator tonight is Tom Horner, who was familiar to many of you as the Independence Party candidate for governor of Minnesota in 2010. Tom left his public relations company in 2010 to run for office, but he's back at it again as the head of Horner Strategies. And from time to time, he agrees to be part of discussions like these. Tom is on the board of directors of Common Cause of Minnesota, and we're very pleased to have him here tonight. Welcome, Tom Horner.
Thank you, Liz. And I want to, again, thank the League of Women Voters of White Bear Lake and Common Cause for bringing us all together and hosting this event on this important topic. Liz talked a bit about what it means this year with the election of a governor in an open race and the Minnesota House of Representatives, and how those newly elected legislators, their colleagues in the Senate, and the governor will come together and, we hope, draw new and fair boundaries. Although, as you will hear tonight, that isn't how it always has worked in Minnesota. And so we will delve into that. Just to highlight, though, how important this topic is to the future of public policy, to the future of fair representation, just think one anecdote, what happened today when the United States Supreme Court decided not to hear the case of Pennsylvania. Most analysts agree now that at least 3 to 4 congressional seats just in Pennsylvania will flip from Republican to Democrat just because new boundaries have been drawn for congressional districts. It's that important, that significant, has that much impact. And so it is an issue that deserves your attention, and I'm greatly appreciative that so many of you were willing to take a couple hours out of March Madness to join us here. We're going to have plenty of time for audience interaction, audience questions. The format tonight, we will hear from each of the panelists talking about an area of expertise that they bring to this issue. And after each segment, we'll talk a little bit with the panel, but we also invite you to think about the kinds of questions that you want to ask. We will have cards available to you. Write down your questions, and we'll make sure that we get to them. And then, if time allows, we'll also have a period at the end of the discussion where we can take some more audience questions. So, without further ado, let me introduce to you our panelists in the order in which you will hear from them. First is Steve Kelley in the blue coat there. Steve is a senior fellow at the Humphrey School. He reminded me I no longer can call it the Humphrey Institute. It is the Humphrey School. Steve served in the Minnesota Senate from 1997 through 2006 and the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1993 through December of 1996. He was chair of the Senate Education Committee for 4 years, and beyond that was a leader on several issues, including technology, energy, and health policy. In addition to his great work in the Minnesota legislature, Steve served in a number of leadership roles in the National Conference of State Legislatures. His community contributions also include service on several nonprofit boards. Earlier in his career, Steve practiced commercial litigation. He received his BA from Williams College, graduating cum laude in 1975, and earned his JD from the Columbia University School of Law in 1978. Steve Kelley. David Schultz at the end of the table there is well known to anyone who pays attention to public policy and politics and watches TV or reads the newspaper in Minnesota. He is a professor of political science at Hamline University. His classes cover a wide range of American politics, including public policy and administration, campaigns and election, and government ethics. That is not an oxymoron. David is also a professor in the Hamline and University of Minnesota Schools of Law, where he teaches election law. He is the author of 30 books and more than 100 articles on various aspects of American politics, election law, and the media and politics. And as I said, he is a frequently sought-after commentator for local and national media on public policy and political issues. He is a 3-time Fulbright Scholar who has taught extensively in Europe and is the 2013 Leslie A. Whittington National Award winner for excellence in public affairs teaching. David Schultz. Susan Brower is the data geek on our panel. Susan is the Minnesota State Demographer and directs the Minnesota State Demographic Center. She became the State Demographer in 2012 and has made it a priority in her role to spend time traveling the entire state of Minnesota, talking with all of us about the new social and economic realities that are brought about by recent demographic changes and what it means to our state. Susan joined the State Demographic Center after working as a researcher on the Minnesota Compass Project at Wilder Research in St. Paul, and prior to that, she worked at the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan. She earned her PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan, specializing in demography and family sociology. She also holds a master's degree in public policy from Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Susan Brower. And last but not least, certainly, Nick Harper. Nick is the Civic Engagement Manager for the Minnesota League of Women Voters. In that role, he helps local leagues provide voter services and collaborate with community partners. He is a member and former co-president of the League of Women Voters of St. Paul. Nick is an attorney and a member of the Minnesota State Bar Association. In May 2017, he received the Sunrise Award from the League of Women Voters in St. Paul for his commitment to the League's mission. He holds a BA in political science with honors from Gustavus Adolphus College and a JD with public service honors from the University of Iowa College of Law. Nick Harper, thank you. And thank you to all our panelists. Our first speaker, Steve Kelley, is going to give us an overview on the national perspective. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Tom. I knew Susan would have a PowerPoint, so I took the liberty of having one of my own, and because there is a map relevant to one of the points that Tom made. So Tom was a little bit overly congratulatory in describing me as an expert on this topic. What I bring to it is experience as a practicing politician who had to care about where his district lines were and who went through several redistrictings. But in my work at the Humphrey School, I am more focused on the intersection of science, technology, and environmental policy than I am with redistricting. But I remain an interested observer in the things that are happening around the country. So I'll try to give you an impressionistic portrait of some of the things that lay the foundation for what may be happening in Minnesota going into 2020 and 2022. So an early warning sign. Anybody who's looked at our constitutional history, American history, knows that the last couple decades are not the first time that we've had conversations about redistricting. Gerrymandering is an old term, but if I think of the recent period of interest in redistricting, if there was an early warning sign that we were entering a new era, it was in Texas in the early 2000s. So somewhat routinely, after the 2000 census, the Democrats, who were then in control of the Texas legislature and governor's office, implemented a new districting plan that somewhat favored the Democrats. But in the 2002 elections, control in Texas switched completely. And contrary to the custom in Minnesota that once you did the redistricting after the decennial census, that was the plan for the next 10 years, the new Republican majority in the legislature said, we're not bound by any sense of custom with respect to that, so we're going to draw new lines that are favorable to Republicans. The Democrats were so outraged by that idea that 52 House members fled to Oklahoma and stayed in a hotel there in order to try to keep the bill from passing. The theory being that if they were in Oklahoma, the Texas patrol couldn't come and get them. So this was sort of a new, I don't think we've ever had members, at least not in recent memories of a party in Minnesota fleeing to Iowa in order to avoid passage of something. Arizona, through a proposition in 2000, so Arizona has initiative and referendum. So in 2000, the people of Arizona adopted 56% to 43%, a plan for an independent redistricting commission, the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. It had 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 1 independent. And so in 2011, the commission drew maps that were seen as favorable to Democrats. The Republicans in Arizona were upset by that, so Governor Brewer, a Republican, attempted to remove the commission chair so that she could potentially appoint somebody new who might change the plan that the commission was pursuing. The Arizona Supreme Court stepped in and prevented her from changing the composition of the commission, and then the Republicans appealed that decision to the U.S. Supreme Court on the argument that the U.S. Constitution gave to the legislature the authority to set redistricting rules. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that the people are the supreme power, and they can act as the legislature, and by adopting this commission, they were setting up a system consistent with the U.S. Constitution. So now the only recourse for the Republicans in Arizona is to, since this was a provision in the Constitution adopted by the people, it's got to go back to the people. And so the Republicans are preparing this year to submit a new proposition that would give them the option of drawing legislative lines. So this is relevant because one of the options for Minnesota is a commission, and so even if there's a commission, it doesn't necessarily tamp down the partisanship that gets involved. So the US Supreme Court is currently considering two cases, Gill versus Whitford from Wisconsin, where the Democrats are challenging Republican drawn maps, and Benesek versus Lamone, where the Maryland Republicans are challenging the flip of a 6th district in Congress that had been consistently Republican to Democrats. And there's a decent argument that the whole Maryland map is pretty tilted to Democrats. So in effect, there's a bipartisan cases in the Supreme Court right now. And the interesting thing about this setup is that by a 2-to-1 margin, the court in Wisconsin, the federal court in Wisconsin, said that the map adopted by the Republicans violated the Constitution by being too partisan. And they had a variety of measures for that, including history of how the maps were adopted. And for the first time, you had a court adopt something proposed by an academic called the efficiency gap. And the efficiency gap is a measure of wasted votes. Now, people's votes aren't actually wasted, but for the purposes of this concept, the efficiency gap, wasted votes are votes that are cast that don't contribute to a victory. So sometimes gerrymandering involves cracking districts apart in order to reduce the power of a minority party, or packing districts with lots of the majority party and a small number of the minority. And so you count the votes of the minority party that don't have an effect. So in a cracked district, it's all the votes that cast by the majority party. And in a packed district, you count the votes of the minority party plus the overvote of the majority party. So if you need 50% plus 1 to win, any vote over that is wasted in this concept because you didn't need that vote in order to win. And so then you do a calculation of the wasted votes for both parties compared to the total number of voters, and you can come up with a percentage. And in Wisconsin, the percentage of the efficiency gap, if there weren't any wasted votes, the efficiency gap would be 0. In Wisconsin, in various elections, the map the Republicans created varied between 13 and 16% against the Democrats. And the court said that statistically, we're going to pick 7% as the margin. And there will be a huge debate about picking that. But the advantage of this from a constitutional perspective is that the US Supreme Court has been struggling with what to do about partisan redistricting because they haven't had a standard by which to evaluate whether a map was too partisan or not. So then, as Tom mentioned, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court got into the action, but they based their decision not on the US Constitution, but on the Pennsylvania Constitution that has language relating to a free and equal vote. And they disallowed maps that had been drawn by the Republicans, and they had as their standard that any congressional districting plan has to consist of districts that are compact, contiguous, nearly equal in population as practicable, and that do not divide any county, city, incorporated town, borough, township, or ward, except where necessary to ensure equality of population. So this may be a little bit difficult to see, but this is the current, or the previous, the map that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court threw out, and you can see the shape of some of the Democratic, the blue districts, and how they might have been drawn. And this is the new map proposed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now, the Republicans appealed because they don't like this map compared to the map that they had before. You can see that there are more districts that are competitive, and so that is where things stand. Now, in that case, they had this past practice focusing on traditional norms, those norms being these concepts of compactness, contiguousness, et cetera, and those are the same concepts we have used in Minnesota. They didn't feel like they needed to use the efficiency gap, but the plaintiffs in that case had urged them to adopt the efficiency gap concept. The court discussed it, but said we don't have to get that far because our good old-fashioned standard for looking at this is sufficient for us to determine that the current maps don't meet constitutional muster, that it is unfair to certain voters in terms of counting their vote. Now, I don't know if this will come up the way I want it to. But 538, which is a statistical website, has what they call the Gerrymandering Project. And on the Gerrymandering Project, you can identify your state, which may be more time than is worth for me to do with you now. But it's a place where you can check out. They run various versions of the maps. And I think one of the things that we'll get into during discussion is that there are trade-offs. Anytime you look at this, in no matter which state you're talking about, you are trying to balance keeping cities or communities of interest together, population equality. But then the question is, should we be aiming to draw competitive maps? So you could draw maps that are more competitive, but may violate some of these other provisions, or you could draw maps that are proportional to the state's overall vote in between the two parties, and that might be different than a competitive map. So there are lots of different criterias, and the 538 Gerrymandering Project website actually, you can look at Minnesota or any other state and see the difference in the maps based on the criteria that you apply. So I am going to stop there, but that's essentially, there's a lot more happening. Texas has got a case that's going to the Supreme Court, and Minnesota, fortunately, we're a few years away, but whatever happens in the Supreme Court this year may determine the rules under which any redistricting, whether it's done by the political parties or by a court, will have to be done. Thanks very much.
I'll give the panel a chance to move around here, and we'll have some discussion. Again, for the audience, if you have any questions, please jot them down on a card, and we'll pick up the card and get your questions answered. While we wait for your questions, let me just throw out a question that talks about the challenge of drawing district lines under any kind of process. So look what has happened in two of the most well-publicized special elections this year. Pennsylvania Congressional race, the Alabama Senate race, where turnout and political activity made a difference. Look in our own state, in the 2000 redistricting, Edina was as red a district as you can find. 10 years later, Edina is represented by 3 Democrats in the legislature. How do you ever draw lines that are fair and that continue to be fair as our population change and as political tactics and sophistication change?
Well, Tom's last point is an important one to emphasize, that one of the ways in which this has become more challenging is that we have so many more statistical and computer-based tools and can really get to fine-grained judgments. And the process in Wisconsin was interesting. They assigned to some Republican staff members the job of drawing maps. And 3 people sat down and started working out maps, trying to maximize. And so all of those different maps, including then their collaborative efforts, were entered into evidence in the Wisconsin case. And you can see the graph. The beginning of some of the maps had an efficiency gap that was closer to 3 or 4%. And the longer they worked on it, the farther it got away from that and more favorable to the Republicans, until the last 3 or 4 maps were around 15, 16%, sort of favoring or disfavoring the Democrats, favoring the Republicans. So I think one answer to your point, Tom, is that the interesting thing about this efficiency gap and the way the statisticians are approaching it is to run lots of different variations of elections. And the basic thing is that after 7%, it gets harder and harder for a natural change in people's allegiances or changes in politics to have an effect on the outcome. That the further outside this sort of 7% range, they argue, you get, you are almost guaranteeing that for 10 years, the party that drew the maps is not going to get tossed out.
Right.
It's easier maybe to say what's not right, to say that, gee, a party ought not be able to guarantee its place in power over a 10-year period through this redistricting process, regardless of all those changes that you pointed out, and still harder maybe to say, okay, what are the parameters for a replacement map if we conclude that this one's inappropriate?
Others agree. I mean, are the politics becoming so sophisticated, party politics, the technology of identifying and turning out voters becoming so sophisticated that well-funded parties with all of the money coming into politics, with all of the smart technology, can that outsmart even the fairest redistricting?
I'm going to say yes, but I want to answer your question in a different way.
All right.
Is that let's just think of, I think, Susan will be able to talk about this a little bit also. Let's say we wanted to do a fair redistricting in Minneapolis or in St. Paul, and we wanted to draw the district lines in such a way as they would be competitive Democrat and Republican. Is there any way that we could realistically draw the lines in Minneapolis and St. Paul for them to be, for state legislative races, let's say, to be competitive Democrat and Republican? The answer is probably no. And we just have to look at the demographics, especially the political demographics, that we're looking at 2 cities that are overwhelmingly Democratic. And part of what I'm getting at, there's a wonderful book that came out a few years ago by a person named Bill Bishop called The Big Sort. And increasingly we have evidence in political science that we are sorting ourselves out politically. The story that I like to tell people is I live in Summit Hill neighborhood of St. Paul, clearly one of the most liberal Democratic neighborhoods, not in St. Paul, if not in Minnesota, if in the country. And about 10 years ago, my neighbor, a Republican, turned to me and said, is there any chance a Republican will ever win a state legislative seat or a city council seat here? And I said, not a chance, Pat. He moved to Eden Prairie. And the reason why I say that, we have evidence of that we just don't like to live next to people who disagree with us anymore politically. And so think about it in terms of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the complexity. How would we have to draw those districts? Probably like as pie slices out into greater Minnesota. Conversely, if I'm in some place in the middle of Minnesota, a Thief River Falls or something like that, I want to draw a competitive Democrat-Republican district, I'm not sure how I would do it either. So the partisan gerrymandering reinforces and reifies existing patterns that are going out there already in terms of how we are spatially, politically sorting ourselves out. That's one complexity that's out here. The second complexity is, of course, the sort that has occurred with the 2 major political parties. In a very different discussion, I would talk about how from 1976 to 2016, the Democratic and Republican parties have profoundly transformed themselves from being coalitional parties composed of liberals, moderates, and conservatives to parties that have almost no ideological overlap now. So combine that geographic big sort along with a partisan polarization sorting out of the parties, and it's becoming very, very difficult at this point to draw fair district lines.
So picking up on that last point, and as close as this question is to my heart, it is an audience question, and that is, Daivd, you talked about what the Republicans and the Democrats are doing in redistricting. Steve, that's what you referenced, talking about Texas and Arizona and some of the other examples. But how do you broaden the representation to include some of the other parties, the Green Party, the Independence Party, some of the other political movements that are occurring? Or does redistricting, no matter how you do it, just have a built-in bias to reinforce the two major parties?
Well, so two answers I'll give here first. One, I'm going to paraphrase Archibald Cox. You know, when I was with Common Cause, I brought him out here in '98 on the 25th anniversary of the Saturday Night Massacre. And he was, in talking about money in politics, he had a far more profound line than I've ever could come up with. And he said, the rules on money in politics are the rules that determine the rules of the game. And I always liked that line. And I mention that because at the end of the day, redistricting is only one of the pieces of the puzzle. Redistricting is one of the things that impacts fair representation, as does the fact what? Money in politics in our political system, as does the fact that we have the two major parties that are writing what? The ballot access rules for the other parties, as is the fact that we use electoral systems that are biased in favor of the two major parties. And so addressing the partisan gerrymandering issue is only one piece of the puzzle. Someday I plan on writing a book called No Silver Bullets, and the whole premise will be of the book to say is that anybody who latches onto one single reform and thinks it's going to solve everything, that's a foolish notion. Here, yes, we have to address the partisan gerrymandering issue, but it's only one piece of the puzzle of broadening the representation to make it more fair for more parties or interests to be represented in our system.
So Steve, when surveys consistently show that voters who consider themselves to be independent are at least a plurality of voters, how are their voices represented in this redistricting debate?
So, okay, I'm a Democrat. Blue is. So just so everybody knows, well, I'm going to turn this question back. You know, we did have a sort of a high tide of an independence party movement in Minnesota.
I like to think there was a high tide at one point. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, Tom, you represented the ebbing of that tide.
Right.
But but one thing that characterized that was that it was always at the state level. So you were running on a statewide basis. Tim Penny ran statewide. Peter Hutchinson ran statewide. Governor Ventura. So you know, a series of candidates. Senator Barkley. So a series of people who ran statewide under an independence banner, but except for the sort of conversion of one or two existing legislators who were in that difficult position in between the two parties to being, at least for a short time, Independence Party legislators, there was no comparable political movement to create a legislative mandate for Independence Party candidates. So I would say, yeah, it's likely tough to see that happen now if it didn't happen during that time period where we had kind of a rise in political activation around a third party that was in sort of in between the two parties in Minnesota. It could come back, but the only way it's going to come back is if people organize. I mean, you know, whatever district you're in, you know, you have to organize around this. Politics is those who show up. So. And I've never been too shy about that. So, and that's an advantage that the League of Women Voters has always had, is they show up,
So one of the questions that keeps coming up from the audience members, and I'm going to hold on to the question, but to get everybody thinking about it, is it realistic to think that Minnesota can take redistricting out of the hands of legislators and give it to an independent commission? So hold on to that, think about it. Because I think it's important to hear from Professor Schultz first to get the Minnesota perspective on the history of redistricting and where we might be going. So let me call Daivd up. He doesn't have any slides, so the panel can stay where you're at on this one. And Daivd Schultz.
Thank you very much. I think I can bore everybody without a PowerPoint. I think I'm capable of doing that. A couple of observations I want to give first, just in terms of, and a couple of disclaimers. First, you mentioned the Gill versus Whitford case. I should point out that I, along with about a half a dozen other law professors, have an amicus in that case. And so I'm arguing in favor of the Supreme Court of ruling that partisan gerrymandering occurred in Wisconsin, and they ought to uphold the efficiency test. And so just so everybody knows where I stand on the issue here. Now, in terms of understanding something about Minnesota, it clearly intertwines Minnesota's history with a lot of national trends. And as I'm trying to think about the ways that I want to describe to understand Minnesota without really, really boring you in the details I mean, I can actually go down to the nitty-gritty, down to cases, people, and persons in terms of the history. But I want to paint the bigger themes instead. And the bigger themes that we find in Minnesota in terms of redistricting over its history, I think are the same themes that we find at the national level. It's a story about power, it's a story about partisanship, and it's a story about competition among the three branches of government. And that's going to be the story to tell in terms of the battle over redistricting. And I also want to sort of, as a context here, is to take us back in time. I think Steve caught this fairly well. If we were to go back, let's say maybe 100 years ago or 150 years ago, anything went in terms of redistricting. Yes, the Constitution required that we do a decennial census. The Constitution requires that we do redistricting after the census. And to some extent, through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, state legislatures across the country were dutiful in their appointed task in terms of having the census occur and redrawing the lines. And the reason why they were dutiful is, think about the United States in the 19th century. It was predominantly what? It was a rural country, and the rural vote dominated the state legislatures across the country, Minnesota and elsewhere. But as we're going to find is that because redistricting is so important, because it determines oftentimes which party's in control, who has political power, what we're going to find is that redistricting hits at that very notion of controlling power. But my, again, broader context here before I get to Minnesota is, again, to think about 100, 150 years ago, depending on the time frame here, is that there were really no standards regarding redistricting, and legislatures could just about do anything that they wanted to. And the whole notion of saying that redistricting, or rather districting, I should say, of legislative seats, whether congressional, whether they are state legislative or other bodies, that they had to meet certain criteria, is really only a consequence of Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s and forward. It is the Baker versus Carr, it is the Westbury versus Sanders, the Reynolds versus Sims at the national level that said that they have to honor the one person, one vote. That's sort of malapportionment or redistricting in terms of population. We get into the 1970s and early 1980s, and the whole issue of racial gerrymandering starts to kick in terms of how districts are drawn in ways to try to disadvantage people of color. But the whole concept of partisan gerrymandering is really a recent legal phenomena. And what I mean by that, it's only to 1986 when the Supreme Court first ruled in the matter that said that perhaps drawing the lines based upon partisan affiliation is unconstitutional. And again, there's a whole lineage of federal cases sorting out back and forth whether or not such a redistricting is constitutional or not, and if so, how do we know it when we see it? But my point being is that our conversation that we're having now, our conversation about partisan gerrymandering, about the Gill versus Whitford case, about the Pennsylvania case, all of this is something actually very, very new, and we're seeing an incredible amount of momentum occurring in the last couple of years, where people are increasingly starting to say that maybe it's not fair by the idea that legislatures get to draw their own lines. Or, as one of my friends said many years ago, we oftentimes let legislators pick their own voters as a result of doing what they're doing here. Or it might be simply a conflict of interest to say that legislators get to draw the lines that determine who gets to vote for them. Lots of different ways of thinking about it, but clearly the values have shifted. But when we think about Minnesota's history, it enters a statehood, back in 1858. It calls in our Constitution back then for district lines to be drawn to reflect population. And we could say that that happened. That happened until about 1913, that after each census, the legislature drew its lines, and they relatively approximated the population in terms of the state of Minnesota. But keep in mind, probably till about 1913, 1914, somewhere in that area, that guess what? We were mostly a rural state. But starting in the early part of the 20th century, the population shifts, starts to move towards the urban areas. And think about it if you're a rural legislator. If you now have to redraw district lines to reflect the shifts in population, to where now Minneapolis, St. Paul have more and more people in them, am I, as a rural legislator, going to want to redraw those lines and potentially put me out of power? The answer is no. And we saw in Minnesota, as well as nationwide, from the early part of the 20th century until literally after World War II into the 1950s, 1960s, that legislatures were dominated by rural legislators who just absolutely refused to redraw the lines. And that was the same thing in Minnesota. From literally 1913 until 1957, we're looking at, do a little bit of math here, nearly 50 years, the legislature said, sure, we will do some redistricting after every census. They kind of made a little cosmetic changes here and there. Again, without boring you on the details, the Minnesota Supreme Court pretty much let them get away with it by saying that as long as you made a good faith effort to try to draw the lines, that's good enough or something like that. Well, good faith was probably not enough at that point. And by 1957, a U.S. district court, that is federal district court, declared Minnesota's districting plan unconstitutional, forcing in 1959 the first redistricting since 1913. They were theoretically drawn by then a nonpartisan legislature, but it was really controlled by Republicans in the Senate and the Democrats in the House. It moved a few seats around, of course, here and there, and it shifted things. But then by the time we get to the 1960s, we have the seminal Baker versus Carr, Westbury versus Sanders at the Supreme Court level, mandating that the seats actually have to meet this one person, one vote standard and have to be as close as possible in terms of equal numbers of people in all the districts. After 1965, the legislative houses were controlled in Minnesota, both houses, by Republicans. They adopted a new plan, and promptly we get to see a pattern that we will see repeatedly in Minnesota. When the legislature is controlled by one party and the governorship by another, what winds up happening? A plan is drawn by the legislature to favor their partisan interests, and the governor decides to veto those, especially when the governor's of a different party. And this eventually resulted in, guess what? The first of many situations over the last 5 decades where state courts had to jump in and redraw the district lines. And this happened in the 1960s eventually, where they were redrawn by the courts. In the 1970s, we saw the same thing also, that the courts had to jump in because there were significant disagreements between the Republican-controlled legislature and the Democrats in the governorship in terms of how to draw lines. And then again, in 1980, we had a DFL controlled both legislative houses, and Al Quie was the governor. And not a surprise, again, we saw partisan disputes leading to what? To a situation where the district lines were basically the governor, the legislature could never agree on the lines. And yet again, they were what? Drawn by the state courts. 1990s becomes interesting. 1990, we now have the Democrats controlling both the House and the Senate yet again. We have Arne Carlson as the governor. And what happens is Arne Carlson decides that he wants to veto the redistricting plan put together by the legislature. Except I think Arne Carlson, or more likely his staff, couldn't count very well. And what I mean by that, if you're going to veto, our Constitution provides that you have to do the veto within a certain number of days. They missed that deadline. And because of that, eventually, after wrangling all through the court system, the courts upheld the Democratic drawn district lines because why? The governor had failed to exercise his veto in time to overturn them. Move us to the early 2000s. We now have what? By the time we get to 2001, we have what? A Republicans controlling the House, the Democrats controlling the Senate, and we have an Independence Party person. Was it Reform Party then or Independent? It was still Reform Party then. It was Reform Party, Jesse Ventura as the governorship, which means you needed to have what? 3 parties actually agree on what to do. And is there any surprise that the moral of the story was what? The Minnesota Supreme Court drew the lines. And the point that I'm going to make here is that the court in Minnesota has drawn the lines most of the time in the last 50 years. And the reason why that's important is for a couple of reasons, is that I think the court has done reasonably well in trying to draw those lines. However, it should not be the job of the courts to be drawing these lines every 10 years. It wastes incredible amounts of money, litigation time, expense, et cetera, et cetera. It all gets fought out. I can tell you that our Supreme Court justices probably would rather not be doing that in terms of the world. But after the 2000 census, we saw an incredible number of incumbent legislators combined and put into districts, resulting in a pretty significant number of incumbents losing office. And then again, in my simple summary again, I will say that after the 2010 census, again, we had partisan disputes that were emerging in terms of drawing the lines. And yet again, the Minnesota Supreme Court drew those lines. Again, I'm passing over a lot of the nitty-gritty detail and some of the litigation, the court cases, the posturing that goes on. The upshot is that we shouldn't think that in situations here that it is the Democrats who are always the evil geniuses or the Republicans who are the evil geniuses. In all those circumstances here, we've seen over a 40 or 50-year time period in Minnesota that both parties have drawn the lines to their advantage. Both of them have postured. Over time, again, I think back in 2010, 2011, proposals to say, for example, what? Let's combine Minneapolis and St. Paul into the same district. Let's make other changes that are out there also. A lot of times, this is just what? It's all about partisanship. All about partisan shifts that are going on. The partisan battles that are going on in Minnesota in terms of drawing the lines, yes, were once about the shift in political power from the rural areas to the urban areas. But we know now in the last 30 or 40 years, it's now what? Shifted to where the majority of the population is in suburbia. So now the battle takes place along a different plane. It is about what? A plane in which now how do some people fight or address that shift in partisanship or the shift in population going to a new area. Where I want to sort of draw my story to a close here, and again, my apologies for not going into all the detail in terms of, again, all the court battles and so forth, is that really where we are at this point is in an interesting time, in an interesting place. That again, 30 or so years ago was the beginning of the battle of starting to say that maybe partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Maybe something needs to be done about it. You know, what we're really seeing, especially since the 2010 census, or maybe even the 2000 census, but certainly the 2010, is how the parties in control are clearly drawing the lines to make sure that they stay in power. And one of the things to be thinking about down the line is that this is likely to also occur in 2020. That's why the Gill versus Whitford case is so important, because if the Supreme Court were to basically rule that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional and adopt whether it is the efficiency gap or some other gap, this potentially has a big implications across the United States, including in Minnesota. And one of the battles that we should be thinking about, and I think Susan can talk about this a little bit also, is that the last I knew, we were on the cusp of losing a congressional seat, perhaps, in 2020. And I don't know if that's still the case or not. And think about the politics that's going to emerge when that occurs, when we have to lose a congressional seat. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So let me ask the panel, and Nick, I might start from you because you didn't get a chance last time. Let me go back to that audience question of whether or not it's realistic to think that we can have some kind of an independent redistricting panel, We'll get into the details later on of the specifics, and you're going to talk about that. But is it realistic? And let me add a question to it. Is the current system of having legislators draw their own districts inherently flawed and biased?
Yeah, so you'll have a lot of people, a lot of reformers, I'll say, argue that legislators drawing their own maps are the fox guarding the henhouse. You have legislators, rather than voters choosing the people that they want to represent them, rather than voters choosing the legislators will draw the maps in such a way that the legislators get to draw what people they want to represent. So there is, to some degree, a conflict of interest if the legislature draws the plan. And it's not, we're going to talk about partisan gerrymandering a lot on this case since it's so pertinent to the current events. But some maps have also seen what is called sweetheart deals for gerrymandering. And so it's not just about the Republican Party gaining power or the Democratic Party gaining power or the DFL party here, but also to some degree, maps have been drawn by legislators in order to protect incumbents, in order to protect against challengers, even including primaries of their own parties. So you might have a party, the two parties get together to draw a map that protects incumbents of those parties, where the Republicans and Democrats say, those are your districts, you get to keep them, these are our districts, we get to keep them, but they're drawn in such a way that we don't think we'll have a primary challenger. So we get to protect our party, and we get to protect ourselves against independents or Green Party. And so you will have sweetheart deals as well, and so the independent commissions have that added benefit of preventing against sweetheart deals as well.
Yes.
Can I throw something?
David?
Okay, I want to throw something else in to sort of strengthen your point that you were making here, is that, again, I mentioned before how I think some demographic changes factor into all this stuff, but take us back to 1976. I want to give you a couple of set of numbers here. There's 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Back in 1976, we could sort of calculate that roughly about 120 out of those 435, roughly 1/3 of them came from what we call swing districts. And what I mean by swing districts, in any given election, they could either shift to Democrat or Republican. And the reason why that's important, swing districts are also the drivers of political compromise. Because if you're in a district that could go Democrat or Republican, you have powerful incentives not to vote too far to the left or too far to the right. And so in 76, we could map out, and there's other things going on too, we could map out and show that the vast majority of the legislation in Congress was bipartisan, driven by the fact that we had about 1/3 of these seats that could go either way. By 2016, the best estimates are, in coming this year, the Cook Political Report has said the same thing. The best estimate is there are only 20 swing seats in the entire U.S. House of Representatives. Now, we happen to have 4 of them in this state, which is really kind of interesting. But for the most part, if I were to close my eyes, plug my ears, and someone said to me, what's your best prediction on what's going to happen in Congress? I could say about 98% of those are going to probably win re-election. And we can tie the lack or the decline of swing seats in part to the rise of what? Polarization in Congress and straight party line votes. Similarly, 134 seats in Minnesota House of Representatives. Again, I'm doing some research on this now and working it through. About 30 years ago, we could have cataloged it at about maybe 30, 35 seats that were swing. My best estimate now is that of those 134 seats, we're probably looking at no more than 15 that are truly competitive. And that speaks something in terms of where not only the demographics fit in, but in terms of where the gerrymandering fits in.
Steve?
I'm going to take a slightly different point of view. If I remember the question right, it's whether it's inherently unfair.
Well, 2 questions, right. Is it inherently unfair, biased, lead to a flawed outcome to have legislators do it? And secondly, is it realistic to think that we can take it out of their hands?
So I'm going to answer the first one first. And my answer is no, but we have to separate our view of the way politics has developed to our point today and go back in time a little bit. So I was elected to the Minnesota House in 1992. My district was Hopkins and part of St. Louis Park. And So that was the map, as David pointed out, that had been drawn by Democratic legislators and not vetoed by Arne Carlson. So it was a partisan map. Well, back then the technology had not been developed to the full extent that it has been today. And as David was pointing out, the culture was a little bit different back then. So then the Democrats didn't do a very good job compared to the standards of today, because in 1998, the House lost control, the Democrats lost control of the House. So Republicans, if there was a tilt, it was not very far, and the election of 1998 put Republicans in power. So, and then in 2002, when the court drew the map again, I was now in the Senate, and my Senate district changed in the sense of, I think I lost a piece of Minnetonka and got a piece of Golden Valley and still had Hopkins and St. Louis Park. So you had, at least in my district, not a huge difference between a partisan drawn map and a court drawn map in terms of the shape of things. So that's one of the rationales for my answering that there's not an inherent conflict. Mm-hmm. Now, given things today, is it realistic? Well, I think it partly depends on what happens in the Supreme Court. Because if the Supreme Court adopts the efficiency gap and says that and including the test that it's 7%, then it might be reasonable for legislators and the governor to say, hey, we don't get to tilt the playing field very far one way or the other. Do we want to do this fight, or should we leave it up to a redistricting commission? I think that, narrowing the potential advantage might make it possible. Nick's point about incumbent protection would still be in play, is that you'd still want to try to keep some of your fellows in. But the other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this conversation is about the congressional district maps. They don't get to draw their own maps. The legislators draw the maps for the members of Congress. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're asking this question about who is drawing maps.
So Minnesota can't change laws through initiative and referendum. We don't have that process here, but we do have a constitutional amendment process. Is it feasible to think that we could get the legislature to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot that would create an independent redistricting? Or, because you have to get a majority vote to get it to pass a constitutional amendment, is it just as likely that they would pass a new commission? David?
I am glad you asked that question, because back in the 1970s, we actually did put a constitutional amendment on the ballot calling for an independent redistricting commission to draw the lines. As some of you may know, that in order for a constitutional amendment to pass, it has to get not just a majority of the voters, but a majority of everybody who voted in that election. It got a majority of the voters, but not a majority of everybody who voted in that election, and therefore that amendment failed. So we have done that once in the past. It is conceivable that we could do it again. I mean, there were a lot of things that came together in terms of the perfect storm in the 70s for something like that to happen. And I would not rule out the possibility that the legislature could, if it wanted to, throw that back on the ballot again. But you're right, we don't have initiative and referendum in the sense of where the voters, well, actually, if you can call it referendum in terms of for the Constitution, if you could call it that, but the citizens don't have initiative to be able to put it on the ballot themselves.
So are we getting to the point where, or have we passed the point, where redistricting now has become subject to the same kind of influences that we see in candidate campaigns, big money, special interest groups, those kinds of features that shape campaigns for elected office?
Yes, the answer is that the politics of redistricting is tainted in the same ways that we could say that any of the other part of our political process is tainted by big money and partisanship and so forth. And that becomes sort of like, this becomes the great dilemma here, that if you want to reform the system, how do you reform a system when the very reforms you want to pass are precluded from occurring by the entities that you want to reform?
Yeah. And I have to
Steve, I think you might have to pull your microphone up a little bit.
Okay, sorry. So back to this point about Congress. So I may have painted a little bit of a rosy view about the potential for change, because if you think about 2022, and if we do lose a member of Congress, the governor and the legislature may not want to be the ones who put the knife in a member of Congress, basically. And so they may rather somebody else do it, or they may just say, we couldn't agree and have the courts do it. But on this question of money and power, right? I use Texas as an example. The Republicans drew it their way. 20-some Republicans, 6. I don't remember all the numbers, but if the Democrats had the levers and could draw it to their advantage, it'd be 20 Democrats instead of 20 Republicans. Okay, so you start to think, all right, that's 10, a switch of 10, and you think the margin in the U.S. House of Representatives is 24, and a few representatives in Texas and a few representatives in Republicans in Wisconsin and a few other places, and pretty soon you're talking about who controls the U.S. House of Representatives. Right. And so that's where the money cares about who controls the U.S. House of Representatives.
Yeah, and if I could throw, again, one more thing in here too, is that I think everything Steve just said is correct here, but we should also think about the fact that part of what happened in '98 in Minnesota, part of what happens, when the Democrats took back Congress in 2006, Republicans take back control in 2010, I still think campaigns and elections matter. At the end of the day, it's still about what? Candidates, about messages, it's about strategy and so forth. And we shouldn't forget that out there also, is that somewhere out here we got those structural variables about redistricting, money, and politics, but I still kind of think campaigns matter.
I would like to make a quick point. We talked about, as Steve pointed out, the U.S. representatives do not draw the maps that they will be in. But as both of them have pointed out, there's a lot of power and money at issue here. And so, of course, those representatives are talking to their local legislators from their parties to make sure that the maps are drawn in a way that they want.
So while Susan gets her PowerPoint set up here, and we have the political people at the panel, let me ask the political question. Redistricting reform is important for fair representation, for better politics, voter engagement. Are there other reforms, though, that may be easier, that could replace the need not replace the need for it, but could at least lessen the impact of our current redistricting system?
Are you clarifying the question? Are you asking for
so
redistricting
what if,
alone,
for
or just
example, we went to
representation?
ranked choice voting, or if we had closed primaries, or if we had a more robust public financing system that would allow more candidates to engage? Would that lessen the impact of redistricting?
Potentially. The point that Nick made regarding incumbent protection and the role of primaries, to the extent that, for example, ranked choice voting might help ensure that we don't have people winning primaries with just a plurality of the vote, as compared to accumulating a majority through ranked choice voting, that could...
So let me just clarify. So for those of you who don't know, ranked choice voting allows a voter to go in the polls and select his or her first, second, and third choice, and then those votes are tabulated, and the lowest one drops off and retabulated until you have a winner with a majority of the votes, by continuing to boost up the second and third place votes and count them in the total. Minneapolis uses it. St. Paul used it for the first time in its mayoral race.
Yeah, and so to the extent that some of the partisanship or the polarization has been driven by fear of a primary, some of these measures that take the primary out of just being like California, right, has an open primary where the top 2 vote getters in the primary, regardless of party, go into the general election. That could be 2 Democrats, could be 2 Republicans. It could make drawing the lines more complicated, if that kind of system. But the interesting thing is that then, in a 2 Democrat situation, you are running to appeal to other than just Democrats, because you've got to get Republicans and independents to vote for you. So that, yes, there are, and the Congress would have to act, but another possibility, which is currently not legal in the US, would be multi-member districts. And that has a potential too. And then you might see a third party in that kind of situation.
All right. We've heard what's happening nationally, the history of redistricting in Minnesota. I'm going to invite the panel to swing around again as we hear how Minnesota is changing and what that means to this whole issue. Susan Brower, our state demographer.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I want to take the conversation in a little bit different direction now and talk about the number of people in each district, how we know how many people there are in each district, and that's by the decennial census. We draw our districts based on the number of people we count. We don't base them on the number of people who live here. And in the best of all possible worlds, those numbers are the same, but there are good reasons to think under certain conditions that we miss people, that the census isn't as complete or as accurate as it could be, and I'm going to talk about some of those issues this time, because in particular, the 2020 census is one that is at risk. I would say at risk at this point. It's going to be tough to take the census this time around. It's always tough to take the census, but especially this time around, and it's because the environment in which the census will be taken in 2020 is exceedingly difficult. It's more difficult than it has been in the past. One of the things that has been in the news a bit, and maybe you've heard about it, has just been the funding challenges for the Census Bureau, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But there's also all kinds of different movements, literal movements of people from one house to another, even on a daily basis, that makes people hard to count. We have a highly mobile population, one that's more mobile perhaps than in a very long time. We have an increasingly diverse population, people with language barriers. We have people who are tired of being asked for their information. I don't want to tell you about my experience at Chipotle, so I'm not going to want to tell you about my very basic demographic data in the census. So we're asked for information all the time, everywhere we turn. It makes it more and more difficult for folks who are taking surveys for the government and taking the census to get a response. Finally, the distrust in the government is really at a high right now. So for some groups, that is for very good reason. For other groups, maybe we could argue about whether it's for good reason or not. But we know that people are not going to necessarily feel safe filling out a census form, telling the US government where they live, particularly if they were born in another country, if they're unauthorized to be here. And I should note that a census counts everyone, regardless of legal status, regardless of citizenship, regardless of age. It counts every breathing human being in the US. And it's going to be tougher to count folks this time because they're going to have less trust. We know that's the case. And yet, the census will happen anyway. It's going to happen. And this is just the environment that we're going to be faced with. So what's happening with the funding? In past censuses, typically what happens is the funding ramps up toward the end of the decade as the Census Bureau starts to test its processes from end to end and then starts to hire outreach workers and starts to hire enumerators. That funding really swings up toward the end of the decade. And you can see the blue line there is the funding swing, the funding cycle for 1990 census. The orange line is for 2000, 2010 is the gray line there, And you can see Census 2020 at this point has barely received an increase. It looks like it's down here, but within the last month, there's been just just a very small increase in the amount of funding. And the Census Bureau has had to cancel some of its tests that it would normally do to make sure that the census is going to go smoothly across all areas. And so there's a real concern that the count we get won't be accurate and complete, in part because the federal situation, the federal funding situation has been, it's been low in terms of the funding, but it's also made it almost impossible for the Census Bureau to plan, to know when they can move forward and start hiring people and do the work that they know is coming in the next 2 years. But the census will happen regardless of whether there are enough people to take it, regardless of whether the systems are ready. The census is going to happen. Why do we care? Well, we've been talking about it today. It's about how well we are represented in St. Paul, how well we're represented in Washington. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. It's also about the fair distribution of resources to our community. We don't often think about it, but the way that we distribute federal money to Minnesotans is on the basis of how many people we have, because it seems reasonable, right? That's how we do it. For many, many programs, it's based on the census. And then we use the data, of course, to make decisions about policies and programs and to think about how we want to move scarce resources around. So that's why we care about the census. If we look at the redistricting, or the congressional redistricting, these are the congressional districts, after the last census, you can see that the areas such as the 7th district needed to grow by about 37,000 people. That was because it lost population, either lost or didn't count population in the census. You can see that District 6 and the 2nd district needed to lose around 69,000 in the case of the 2nd, 96,000 in the case of the 6th district, and that's because there was so much population growth there that those districts needed to contract to make equal numbers across all of the districts. Now, what's happening this time around is that the majority of the growth is happening in the 7-county metro. So we're not seeing that growth in the exurban areas as we did in the past. We're seeing most of the growth, 98,000 people of the 179,000 people added in the first 5 years of this decade were in Hennepin and Ramsey County. Now, between the last two censuses, this is just a story about how concentrated the growth has been in the center cities, in the urban counties. Between the last two censuses, Minneapolis worked really, really hard to get a good census count. They networked, they engaged, they did their outreach, and they got their census count back in 2010, and they had lost 40 people. 40 people over the course of the whole decade. Now, if we look at where Minneapolis is right now, from 2010 to 2016, they've added an estimated 30,000 people. So there's a tremendous amount of growth, not only in Hennepin and Ramsey County, but even in the very center cities. And St. Paul is the second fastest growing city in the state right now. And that's something we haven't seen for a very long time. We've seen this outward expansion. It's right in the center this time. So that's where we're likely to be seeing a lot of the movement in districts, just because we see so much population change there. You can see in this map that on the western side of the state and the southern side of the state, it's a little bit hard to read, but that's actually, those gray areas are where we see population losses. And so we'll expect to see that districts there will need to expand to accommodate the loss of population. The same is true with state legislative districts. Again, rural areas are concerned that if they don't count all of their residents, that their districts will have to expand even further than they would just because of population loss. And the same is true with urban districts, that they're afraid that they won't count all the new residents that they have. So there's a lot of concern out there that we get this census right. Just to give you a sense of how much federal money is pushed around on the basis of census, this is just the largest 16 federal programs to the state of Minnesota, and it's about $1,500 per person counted per year, or $15,000 over the course of the decade. And that's in the largest 16 federal programs of money granted to Minnesota, either the state, the county, or local communities on the basis of census funding. That comes in the form of Medicaid, it comes in the form of HUD, USDA, transportation, across the board, education. People just use the census count to distribute funds. And the same is true for state monies as well. So it's incredibly important that we get this right. And given the fact that the Census Bureau is in trouble with respect to its funding, we should be concerned as well, just for the health and the fairness that happens as a result of the funding and the political redistricting. I want to briefly talk about what reapportionment looks like, what I think it will look like this time around as we move forward. Will Minnesota lose a congressional seat? Well, last time we were told before 2010 that we were likely to lose a seat. We were just on the cusp, and a lot of people got organized and a lot of people got out the count, and we were able to hold on to that 8th congressional district. It's likely that the same thing will happen, well, I hope the same thing will happen this time around, but we are, again, on the cusp of losing a congressional seat. There's a number of ways that you can estimate what's coming. I don't believe that it is absolutely going to be the case that we will lose one. It's just that we're in the right ballpark at this point. That's because even though Minnesota is growing, we're not growing as fast as many of the other states who would receive an additional congressional seat. There have been some projections that have looked at just how close we are at this point to keeping that 8th congressional seat. And they range right now in 2017 somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people. Now, when I look at that as a demographer, I don't think that's a very big number. I don't think that's particularly out of reach. And the other thing that's important to look at is that the states that are posed to gain a seat are also part of the equation. If they don't have enough growth to kind of outgrow our seat, then it affects whether or not we're able to hold on to ours. So it's not just a race kind of at the bottom of the list of states, the slower growing states, it's also a race to meet that threshold of an additional seat. The first thing they taught me in demography school and the last thing they told me out the door is don't believe a number that they put in front of you. There is no number you should believe, and you should be skeptical about every number anyone would ever put in front of you. And so I want to point out that the estimates that we have right now are just estimates. The count that we will have after the decennial census is a count, but it will have its own error. And that there's a lot of assumptions that need to hold true in order for the congressional apportionment to play out as they've been projected. So I look at all these numbers. I look, for example, at how many people we missed. An estimated 83 to 172,000 people missed in the last census. And I think that, putting all these numbers together tells me that I really don't think that it's outside of the realm of possibility that we hold on to that 8th seat, but we're certainly there teetering on the edge again. So again, where we started, it's going to be a tough census. It's so important that we get this right. Especially, we've been talking about the redistricting, but for a number of other reasons as well. And so with that, help me count people.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. That was terrific. So let me ask maybe an unanswerable question for all of you, and that is, when you look at the demographics of Minnesota, how the state is changing, how do you draw the line between saying this district was drawn for partisan purposes and this district was drawn to ensure equity among our new Minnesotans and among the growing populations of color?
That's the $64,000 question right there. It really is.
Yeah.
And that's the question that the Supreme Court has struggled with. Again, if we go back to 1986, In 1986, the Supreme Court said that, yes, in fact, we believe that partisan gerrymandering does violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, and therefore, to use a legal term, is justiciable. We should be able to enter into the game. They proposed back then a test for measuring partisan gerrymandering, which included several different factors. It looked at, for example, whether or not there was any kind of intentionality on the part of the legislature to try to disadvantage another party. Is it a disadvantage that transcends more than one election, for example, another factor that was being looked at here. And so they struggle with it. But from '86 until the early 2000s, the Supreme Court and no federal court ever found that there was a partisan gerrymandering. The case, we have a Pennsylvania case in which the Supreme Court revisits this issue again, and the court's divided. The court, 4 members of the court were saying at that point, we don't think, actually, 5 members of the court said in Pennsylvania back then, there's no partisan gerrymander. Of those, 4 of them said that yes, we still think, or we don't think that this is an issue that the court should be involved in. 4 members of the court said, well, we don't know what the test is, but we do think it's unconstitutional. A couple of years later, the Supreme Court steps in and says the same thing. And so where we are right now is that we've got what we think is a bare majority of the court saying that, yes, we believe that there is, that it is unconstitutional to engage in partisan gerrymandering. We just don't know what exactly the test is to figure out when it's occurred, because there are so many other variables out there. And again, that is the struggle with Gill versus Whitford in terms of, is there some way that we can quantify or measure partisan gerrymandering? But you are getting at a really tough question here because, again, going back to what Steve said before, is that Democrats in Minnesota draw district lines in the 90s and think, we've done our job. We've set it up for the Democrats, only to have what? In 1998, a whole bunch of things occur to where what? Campaigns, candidates, strategy matter. So it's always difficult to sort that out, and that's the problem with the Supreme Court is. Now, I will say, if we can read tea leaves, if it means of anything, the Supreme Court did accept a second partisan gerrymandering case for this term, besides the Wisconsin one out of North Carolina, seeming to suggest, as some of us scholars are, or some scholars are arguing here, that maybe the court wants to handle both of these at the same time and is going to actually rule on the issue in terms of a standard. But again, we're just guessing. And that's really the challenge. Now, you're really asking the tough question here.
Steve? Or Nick, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Nick.
I was just going to add, David gives the example of Minnesota with 1998, and I think that's very important to know that historical information. But, because, and we touched on this, the data and the technology has changed. The game's changed. I like to say that they used to be drawing districts with handsaws. Now they're doing it with surgical precision. Yep. And that's actually, I stole that language from a redistricting case in North Carolina, where the court said that the party had targeted Black Americans with surgical precision because they were able to use this data. So, that data might not have been available in 1998, and our ability to manipulate that into a map that's favorable to a particular party was not available. So I would just say that we have to be cautious because the more able we are to use this data and the algorithms available, the more likelihood it makes it to do this gerrymandering. The silver lining there is that hopefully if you can get a court and lawyers smart enough to do it, you might be able to use that data to prove otherwise, that it was for either a racial gerrymandering versus partisan gerrymandering.
I'm going to pick up a different part. I think it's hard to predict. There are 2 parts to this. One is we might want to draw a map that did a better job of representing less represented people. You could set that up as one of the criteria. The likelihood is that it would then conflict with other criteria you might be interested in, like competitiveness or maintaining certain communities of interest or something like that. So I think that's one of the challenges facing us, is that that as we say we want to prioritize certain criteria, there are consequences to that with respect to other goals that we might have for a fair election system. So that's one. The second is you just can't predict this, right? So my former colleague Phyllis Kahn represented an area in Minneapolis. When the court drew that district in 2011, they were not aiming to change the ethnic representation of that, and in fact, Phyllis won a couple more elections. But last year, the demographic change in her district resulted in the election of a Somali woman to the Minnesota legislature from that part of Minneapolis. And we've seen other instances in Minnesota where we had the first Hmong American legislator from St. Paul, where the districts not drawn to enable particular ethnic representation through demographic change, and as the point David's been making, organization, community relationships, and these other kinds of things, candidates have been able to succeed even though they are what we think of as underrepresented, members of underrepresented groups.
So Susan, a question for you. With Minnesota on the cusp of keeping or losing its 8th congressional seat, and heeding your last slide here that the success of the census is in our hands, could we make it more in our hands by appropriating state money to enhance our ability to do the count? Would that be recognized? And given that we're awash in money in this state, at least today, is it something that the legislature might ever consider?
Yeah, well, the legislature actually has considered it and has given money to particular the state government and the office that I run to hire 1.5 more people to help do the census. So it's been a modest increase, but it's there. It's akin to what has happened in earlier censuses, about the same level of increase of staff. So it is there. There are other states that are proposing much more money be put into outreach. Georgia, California in particular, and New York are 3 states that are proposing that they're going to put a lot of money. I don't know that it's fully passed at this point, but there are other states who have gone above and beyond, but there are not a lot of states that have given any money. So we're still kind of on the leading edge of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Nick and David are going to talk about some of the redistricting reform proposals, and then Nick is going to join Steve in talking about, so what can you do, what can we all do to make this better? So I'm going to ask you maybe just stay at your seats and do it from there. If I could also ask you to be very focused in your comments to make sure that we have time for audience questions before we wrap up at 9 o'clock. So Nick and David on the reform proposals.
Sure. So I will talk about the Carson Mondale plan. This was a plan that was developed by former Governor Arne Carlson and former Vice President, Democratic Vice President Walter Mondale. The plan is genius in the sense that it's not too different from what we on accident do here in Minnesota already. Essentially, it's a panel of judges will draw the maps. So the difference there is that rather than going through an expensive litigation process, failing to draw the maps, going through an expensive litigation process, and then having the court appoint a panel, the plan just appoints a panel of judges right off the bat. So the system would be that the majority leader of the Senate, the minority leader of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the minority leader of the House would each appoint one judge, a retired Court of Appeals judge. Those 4 judges would then choose a 5th judge who would chair the commission. Those 5 judges would then use nonpartisan advisory staff to help draw the maps and create redistricting principles, which are the criteria for how you draw the map, including, keeping together communities of interest, not splitting apart cities and counties, those kinds of things. So those 5 judges would draw the maps, and then the maps would go to the legislature for an up or down vote. The key here is that it does have to go to the legislature for an up or down vote because skipping past the legislature would require a constitutional amendment, which we talked about how that might not be likely. So by keeping the last final say with the legislature with an up or down vote makes it a little bit easier because then the system only has to go into statute, which is a lot less difficult of a fight to have. The judges would also be bound by the Judicial Code of Conduct, which requires impartiality and fairness, which is different than, of course, the current system where the legislators, while of course we expect them to be ethical, are not necessarily bound to any particular code of conduct of impartiality. And then the final additional benefit is that if the legislature draws the maps, they can do that in secret in their caucuses behind closed doors, come to committee with a map already drawn and say, this is the map, we're voting on it. They'll take public comments, but they won't make any changes to the map, and then it goes straight on. With the Carson Mondale plan, the judges would be required to hold at least 3 meetings throughout the state in order to listen to constituents and Minnesotans throughout the state to get their comments on the maps. And then an additional benefit as well would be that the panel in its meetings, as well as the could be subject to the open meetings law if the statute went that way, and also to some degree if the legislatures chose when they passed the statute, could also be open to the Minnesota Data Practices Act, which is our local version of the Freedom of Information Law, which means that constituents could request information from the panel and say, you know, well, how did you come to that conclusion? What's your documentation for that? And the panel of judges would have to show that because those documents would be public record. And that's the Carson Mondale plan in a quick pinch.
All right, great. One of the things I want to talk a little bit about just for a second here, and I'm going to talk about Iowa, because I'm a particular fan of the Iowa system, the way they do it down there. But in the beginning of our presentation, Steve talked a little bit about an Arizona case. And the Arizona case was interesting, went up to the Supreme Court because the voters in Arizona weren't thrilled by the fact that the legislature was drawing district lines, and they're an initiative and referendum state, and they basically created whether I can't remember if it's a bipartisan or nonpartisan was out there. I can't remember what it was.
It's by part 2, 2, and 1.
Okay, it was a bipartisan redistricting panel, and several legislators, not liking that idea, challenged it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And part of what that case was about was whether or not the Constitution actually required the legislatures or a legislature to actually draw the lines. And the Supreme Court said no, that in an initiative and referendum state, that you could allow for the people to take that power out of the hands of the legislature and give it to a commission. And the reason why I mention it here is that, again, when you talked about the Carson Mondale one, that's an approach of trying to make the changes in Minnesota without the constitutional amendment, and recognizing the fact that the legislature would still get the final sort of vote in terms of what it wants to do. Given the Arizona case, you could set up a scenario where you take that power ultimately out of the hands of the legislature and turn it over to somebody else to be able to make that call. Of course, if you do that, you have some accountability issues for any type of body that is set up that's not elected. And I just mention that because as we think about different options here, we may all feel very comfortable at one level and say, well, sure, take it out of the legislature's hands, give it to a bunch of unelected, geeks or something like that, let them do all that kind of stuff. Well, then we have to worry about the process of accountability that's there also. And I mention that because part of what I like about the Iowa system, Iowa has had a bipartisan redistricting system for quite a few years. It's by state constitution in terms of how it's set up, and how it works is roughly something parallel, to what you described for the Mondale Carlson approach, where we're going to have people put on that panel who are going to, be selected by the parties in the legislature. The critical feature, again, paralleling what they came up with, is the fact that once the plan is come up with, and there'd be hearings, there's transparency in Iowa in terms of how the plan comes up. The legislature gets an up or down vote. They can't amend it. They can't sort of say, well, let's move this around here, et cetera, et cetera. It's up or down. Legislature, if they vote it down, commission gets to do it again. Legislature send it back to our commission gets to send it back to the legislature. If there's 2 rejections in terms of the up or downs, then at that point, the 3rd plan in Iowa is the one that would go into effect. So it still gives the legislature some opportunity as, let us say, a policing mechanism. And I think that's important at the end of the day, is that it's a lot easier for me, to vote out of office, not that I would have done it, but it'd been easier to vote Steve Kelley out of office than it is to throw commissioners out of office or something like that. Yeah, I was going to say, okay. But you know the point that I'm getting at here is that there's accountability with you. There's some accountability here. And Iowa tries to affect those trade-offs between saying we're going to take it out of the legislature, we're going to make it, bipartisan. Again, the question is, could we make it nonpartisan? That may be very difficult to do, I don't know. Or multi-partisan, I don't know, it's another possibility. But at the same time, combining it with some checks, some controls with the legislature, ultimately recognizing the fact that if the legislature rejects it a couple of times, it may not be because it's about a fairness issue or a check, it may be because of partisan issues. Okay, I'll stop there.
So what do we the people do?
So what do we the people do? So that's a great question. The answer is pretty simple. You talk to your legislator and you talk to your friends and your family and your neighbors. The idea here is if you want change, it has to happen through some kind of change in the law, probably by statute, maybe by constitutional amendment if you get really lucky and have a lot of friends and a lot of family. But you have to talk to those people. You can do that, of course, with your legislator. You can always call them, write to them, email them, even show up at their door at the legislature and say, hey, I want a 15-minute meeting with my legislator. With your friends and family, you and your neighbors, you ask them to come to events like these. You educate them on the issue and say the redistricting is important because it's about fair representation in Congress, because it's about fair representation of communities, because it's about funding from the federal government. Yeah, that's the short and sweet.
Let me throw one more thing in. I'm teaching intro-American politics at Hamline University, and one of my students in class the other day, we were talking about the elections, and he said, do the 2018 elections really matter? And I kind of rolled my eyes at first, and I said, well, every election matters, et cetera, like that, and was trying to sort of explain, and he wanted to ask it in terms of the context of redistricting, and I said, well, yes, who controls the legislatures in 2021, 2022 is going to be really important, but we also shouldn't forget about the fact that the governor's race this year is going to be critical too, but and in terms of that governor's going to be in place then, but also I suggested to him that that this is a good time to be thinking about the redistricting issue, because if we don't plan in advance, this is like Susan talking about the census having to plan in advance to ramp up and to be ready for it. If we'd say 2020 hits, now let's worry about the issue of redistricting, we're going to have the legislature so busy with so many other things in terms of what? Drawing those district lines, or who knows what's going on. At that point, there'll be lots of elections. They may not be able to get to the things they need to do. We need to be sort of pressing now to say, let's have something in place now, or move something now so it's in place for 2020 so that we're ready for it. And I guess, what's the old Boy Scout adage, be prepared? Maybe that's what we're talking about here. Let's be prepared.
Of course, that in addition to writing directly to your legislators, I would also encourage you to talk to the candidates as well. You can do it at candidate forums like the ones that the league sponsors. You can do it at other candidate forums. You can do it at the town halls and candidate meet and greet events that the candidates themselves host. Ask the candidates what their opinions are on the issues. You can also, of course, I would suggest when you talk to your legislators, don't ask or the candidates, don't just ask, do you support an independent commission? Dig deep into what their actual positions are on that issue. Do they support a bipartisan commission? Do they support a nonpartisan commission of judges? Do they support multi-partisan perspective? If they say that they support the Carlson Mondale plan, and you absolutely love the Carlson Mondale plan, great. Don't stop there. Say, great, how do we make it even better? Because you can always tweak it to make it better. Don't just accept the first answer they give you just because it's a good one. Try to make it a great one.
So Steve, you served in the legislature. Legislators must get thousands and thousands of emails and letters and phone calls every week. How do you break through the clutter?
Okay, I have 3 key points to make, and in the course of it, I'll get to that. So one is, let's follow up on, let us not forget about Susan's point. And there are 2 things that you can do. One is talk to legislators about additional support in Minnesota for an accurate count. And secondly, Congress is doing the budget this week, and the signs are that they aren't, there'll probably be another CR, a continuing resolution. So you have an opportunity to contact your member of Congress and say, hey, when you finally do a budget, increase the funding for the Census Bureau so that we can have an accurate count in 2020. So those are 2 things where people's voices could potentially make a difference, because you might be the only person mentioning this topic to your member of Congress or to a legislator. That would be one way to cut through the clutter, is to be sort of an outlier in terms of what you care about. Secondly, I'm going to reinforce Nick's point, because I've been at a couple DFL district conventions, and just saw a really promising young woman who's going to run in a tough district in Eden Prairie. And if now is a time to get her thinking about it, it's really right now at the beginning of her campaign. And so this is happening around the state. There are candidates who are new. At least my perception in the DFL is that there are quite a few new young candidates who are potentially open to the kind of argument that Nick was talking about, and the time to get to them is now. And I wouldn't pepper them so much with questions, but be in a position to inform their position about what you see as the benefits of an independent commission. And the third thing that I'm interested in Nick's and David's reaction to is, Nick described the fact that the panel of judges would come up with the principles. So one of the questions you should be asking yourself is, should the principles be in the law, telling this panel what to do, as opposed to letting the panel come up with its principles? Because the principles are really important. Do we want to move competitiveness up towards the top of the principle list? Do we want to stick with the traditional ones of compactness, contiguous, and fair in terms of the overall numbers? And the other thing about timing is, I always remembered the person or persons who went door knocking with me. So if you want to make an impression on a legislator and cut through the clutter, it is to go knock on doors with them, because those are I remember those people lots better than I ever remember the donors to my legislative campaigns, because they were out there doing the tough work. And so if you really want to have an influence, that's the place.
So Steve raised an important question. Who determines the principles?
I think that has to come from the legislature at the end of the day. I was thinking, was it last year it was? I'm sorry, I'll get a little bit closer to here. I think the principles have to come from the legislature and be openly debated, where we come up with a conclusion in terms of what are the values that we think are important for drawing districting. I mention that because about a year ago, I think it was, or maybe it might have been last legislative session, already there is legislation percolating through the state legislature, some good, some of it I'd say really bad from my opinion, in terms of trying to define what those principles are supposed to be, so that when the legislature does the first swipe at it in 2021, those are going to be the ones supposed to be guiding it. But yeah, at the end of the day, we know the courts have imposed some criteria, that it's got to be one person, one vote. We know compact, contiguous, et cetera, like that. But I think it's still worth that conversation. And again, if in fact we think, and I think we do, still live in a representative democracy, it is us through our representatives that should be saying that these are the values that are important that we want to have for fair representation.
I would add, I agree that it would be nice if legislators could put that into statute so it's not done on an ad hoc basis every 10 years by either the legislators themselves or by a judge of panels or a commission or whoever. But I mean, they also had the chance to do that for the past however many decades and didn't do it. And I will say that, you know, I like to think that the legislator is going to be open and discuss these issues transparently. I just don't know whether that will actually happen, given how not transparent the legislature can be sometimes. Sometimes they will write a bill in the dead of night and pass it, and not give a lot of notice to the public. So I absolutely want this debate and discourse and transparency. I just don't know that the legislature will actually provide it.
Susan, I have a Donald Rumsfeld question for you about the known unknowns. And that is, how do you know if you've undercounted or if you've overcounted?
Oh, yeah. So there's something called a post-enumeration survey, which just means that they do an in-depth survey after a census and get a good estimate of that from following up with different areas. And that's where they come up with the numbers that I shared with you about somewhere between, you know, somewhere around 100,000 as an undercount in Minnesota.
Okay.
Yeah.
So against accepted standards of how you do a census, how you collect and
That's
analyze
right.
data.
Yeah, right. It's a second survey that they compare against the full count. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
all right.
But it's not adjusted. I should say whatever the count is stands. They just try to get a sense later of how good it was.
Yeah. So congressional districts are supposed to be across the country, all 435, equal in number of the population. Changes a little bit over the 10 years, but then it's supposed to be brought back to a norm. Legislatures vary wildly in terms of each state and how much each state representative or state senator, how many people they represent. Minnesota has one of the largest state legislatures, 201 legislators. If we made the legislature smaller, and there's a proposal this year, as there is almost every year in the legislature, to shrink the size of the legislature. If we shrink the size of the legislature, make legislative districts larger, does that make redistricting easier as defined as more fair? The larger the people, the larger the number of people that you're putting into the district, does it make it easier or harder to get to some accepted standards of fairness? Susan, just as a demographer.
I don't know about getting to the accepted standard of fairness.
Do you have less
but
room
I
for
would say-
manipulation, or do you have more room for manipulation? Let me ask it that way.
I think the opportunity for manipulation is there, whether it's small or whether it's large. But I would say from the perspective of people who are being represented, overwhelmingly, they want them to be small. I mean, that's just what we hear.
Okay.
I think the risk in a larger district is that a number of our minority populations would have a harder time being represented in larger districts. I think that would be something you'd have to keep in mind. The other thing is, you know, this question isn't just about redistricting or, you know, sort of the fairness of this kind of question because, okay, nobody really likes to go door knocking. I mean, I have colleagues who say they love it, and maybe I believe them, but mostly I don't. And but I, you know, after doing it in 6 different elections,
What time of year do you do it?
summer and fall.
Okay.
Though in special elections you do it in the snow.
And in Minnesota in October, sometimes you do it in the snow.
Yeah. In my House district, I could for sure knock on every door, and therefore have at least a chance of meeting a constituent. And most of my, and in some cases in a House district, I could knock on some doors, especially if it was a swing precinct. I'd knock on them more than once. In my Senate district, and Tom's right, I mean, we do have a larger legislature. We have the largest Senate. So at 67 senators, we're the largest. And so I think, and as of the last redistricting, a Senate district has 80 or 85,000
85, I think.
people in it. And so you think, okay, maybe that's 40 to 50,000 households. So then you start to think, okay, knocking on 50,000 doors is a lot, but you could still, in theory, get to many of them. And so the question is, what kind of politics do you want? Is it a politics where legislators see it as a face-to-face kind of business, or where the district is so large that knocking on doors doesn't make sense as a campaign method anymore, and you are getting mail and a variety of other contacts? The California, the state Senate districts are bigger than congressional districts. So that is all a different kind of campaigning than my experience of doing it. And so besides this question of redistricting fairness, you have to decide what kind of politics you want.
I think it's a really good point to underscore here, because I think one of the challenges that Minnesota is facing right now is a growing pains problem in a different way. Is, take us back 20, 30, 40 years ago, we had several million fewer people in the state than we do now. What are we, 5.5 million now approximately? We're 5.5 million. At some point we're going to be 6 million people. And how do we do the type of politics in Minnesota that has been, I'm going to use Tip O'Neill's line, kind of retail politics, the door-to-door knocking where everybody the legislators get to know everybody, and it's a part-time legislature. I think as you start to create, as a state is just growing, we have to sort of think how we actually are going to conduct our politics. What I was also thinking about the other day, I was at the legislature and talking to a couple of legislators who represent rural districts, and you were relatively lucky. I mean, you represented, one or two, maybe three municipalities or something like that in your district. And I know most legislators try to make it to the local council meetings and things like that. Try to sort of pop in. Imagine some of the rural districts right now. And I was talking to one, state senator who's got something like 30, I can't remember, it was like 35 or 40 cities within his district, just trying to go out and talk to all the people who are the elected officials in those cities. That's really hard. Now, let's say we cut the Senate in half. We're going to have people representing, maybe 70, 80, 90 cities or something like that. That becomes a very complex task. And I don't envy those legislators in terms of the work that they have to do to try to make sure they're representing those people.
Well, and if you think about the rural area,
Yeah.
The variation
Yes.
in the needs across those larger rural districts would be tougher. I was lucky in a variety of ways in terms of timing and the communities I represented, but Hopkins and St. Louis Park had similar, not exactly the same, but similar values around education and other kinds of things, and I had grown up there, so I kind of knew, if you have this larger districts, it's harder to say I am representing both figuratively and literally the people of the district.
So, I'm sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Susan, did you have a point? Okay. Just kind of to go back to the original question of does it make redistricting and manipulation into gerrymandering more easy? My initial instinct would be that the more people you have, the more permutations of a map you have, and therefore the more likely it is that you could manipulate the map.
To have larger districts.
If you had larger districts, because each district would have more people, I think it would be easier. I mean, if you think about it, assume you had 5 people in Minnesota. That's just hypothetically. And you needed to make 5 districts of those 5 people. You could only draw one map, and it would be one person per district. If you increase that to 10, you could do a couple of changes, and there might be a couple of variations there, but you couldn't manipulate it too much. But the point is, the more you grow that population, the larger the district, the greater number of people in that district, I would think the more ability to manipulate that district to fit the population you want it to be, rather than the population that fits best within a fair map.
Susan?
I could see that.
Okay.
I would say that what we've seen in terms of manipulation is sometimes read as manipulation when it isn't indeed manipulation, and that there are a million different ways to measure some of these criteria. So I guess it's a hard thing to measure.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So just a couple of minutes left and a couple of quick questions. One is from our audience, Cynic, who wonders if the placement of prisons is large enough to impact the redistricting. So keeping in mind that many felons lose their right to vote, is that too cynical to think that the placement of correctional facilities become, or the creation of private prisons become part of this redistricting argument?
They can impact the districts, they absolutely can, and they have impacted the districts. What the Census Bureau is proposing this time is to provide a data file that would allow states who want to remove prisons from the redistricting process or other funding kind of mechanisms to be able to do so.
Okay.
You could just as easily ask that same question about universities. So like, if all the students at Mankato State vote, you elect socialists as Democrats there. So, the same thing in other parts of the state. If, in St. Cloud, St. Cloud's a swing district, partly because of the variation in turnout at St. Cloud State. So, if a lot of students show up, you can elect a Democrat. If they don't show up, you get a Republican. So it's not, I wouldn't just think about prisons.
I would like to add on to that, though. To some degree, university students do get to choose their residents. Prisoners do not.
Another question, and this one has to be very quick, even though it's a complicated issue. And it goes back to an issue you raised, Steve, about proportional representation or multiple representatives from one district. So two variations of this posed by different questioners. Multiple representatives from a single district based on the percentage of vote, or convert the legislature into an entirely at-large body where a representation is allocated by the total vote cast in the state. Any of them make sense? Any of them even a glimmer in some legislators' eye?
I'll let Steve address both of it. I would be really hesitant about an overall at-large one for two reasons. One, even though the Supreme Court said that legislators represent people, not geography, geography is still important. We shouldn't discount that. And second, we know that more often than not, when we go to at-large districts, it has a disproportionate impact upon people of color and on minorities. And so I would be very, very hesitant if we were to go in that direction. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think place is, I think of it as place, as community, and representing community of interest is one of the principles that can be included. So I would be against number two. Vermont actually has a multi-member legislature. So doing it for Congress would be dicey given the Constitution, but we could potentially do it in Minnesota because there's at least one state that has it, and I knew a guy from there, state senator from there, who found it worked fairly well. So, but he did represent, he and two other members represented a particular geography.
So, before we close, I've got to put you on the record. So presume that coming into 2020, we have some variation of a divided government, a Republican body in at least one, the House or the Senate, maybe both, and a governor of another party, or a governor of one party and a divided legislature, some permutation of divided government. Are we likely to redistrict in 2020 the same way we did in 2010, in 2000? Steve, or David, you're shaking your head yes, you think that no change?
Yeah, barring something unforeseen, the Supreme Court does it again.
Yeah. Nick?
Agreed. I don't really see a chance of there not being disagreement.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, playing the odds, I would say this same.
Okay. And Susan?
I stay
I
out
know
of
you're
this
a
stuff.
non-political person, but yeah.
She's the smart one of the group.
So please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, terrific discussion, Susan Brower, Stephen Kelley, Nick Harper, and Daivd Schultz. I also want to thank the League of Women Voters of White Bear Lake and the Common Cause of Minnesota for sponsoring this forum. These are enormously complicated and difficult and time-consuming to put on. So a big round of applause for the League of Women Voters and Common Cause. And then a reminder that playback of this program will be on Channel 16 every Monday at 10:30.